And again, welcome to the Carter Schools Peace Week. This is the session on emergent evidence-based practices supporting SDG 16. This is hosted by the Better Evidence Project, an initiative of the Center for Peacemaking Practice here at the Carter School. I'm Susan Allen. I'm an associate professor in the Carter School, and I also direct the Center for Peacemaking Practice and am principal investigator with the overall responsibility for Better Evidence Project. The Better Evidence Project is focused on preventing and ending war. And we are focused on this by providing evidence-based guidance to policymakers, practitioners, and donors. We fill gaps in the knowledge base, address needs identified by policymakers, practitioners, and donors for knowledge and guidance from the research. And we bring the insights of research into useful forms, conveying research beyond the academy. So this event is part of that, and grateful that you all have been able to join us. And thanks very much to our panelists for making time to be with us today. I want to also ask if you'd like to join the mailing list of the Better Evidence Project to receive our newsletter and announcements of future events. Please send an email to BEP for Better Evidence Project at gmu.edu with a note, and we'll add you to our distribution list. So we at the Better Evidence Project, the Center for Peacemaking Practice, we're focused on practice and practical research in peacemaking. And we're honored to be part of the Carter School and the Carter Schools Peace Week, which this year is focused on SDG 16. The Sustainable Development Goal 16 focuses on peace, justice, and strong institutions. So today we'll examine evidence-based practices supporting SDG 16, building on the Better Evidence Project focus on bringing the best of academic research to policymakers, practitioners, donors, so that we can expand the knowledge base. And in this case, we're focused on expanding it to create the peace, justice, and strong institutions of SDG 16. So again, before we move on, I just want to acknowledge that this event is being recorded and welcome you. Thank you to Ziad and Margarita, who've been helping admit everyone from the waiting room and managing the opening of the Zoom process as we all join. Thank you to the presenters who've joined us and to all of you participants who've joined us. The order for the presentations today will start with Adeline Sibanda, then go to Tammy Smith, then Yekaterina Romanova, Yaoska Barrios, and Margarita Tadavosian. And then we are planning to save substantial time for discussion and questions with the presenters. So let me begin by introducing Adeline Sibanda, our first speaker. So Adeline is the founder and managing director of Adasim Developments, and she serves on the advisory board of the Better Evidence Project. Adeline has 28 years of experience in strategy, program design, planning, monitoring, and evaluation. She's passionate about promoting the use of evaluative evidence in all policy processes. Adeline has worked in over 23 sub-Saharan African countries with civil society organizations, community-based organizations, governments, UN agencies, and other development partners. She is past co-chair of Eval Partners, past president of the International Organization for Cooperation and Evaluation, and past president of the African Evaluation Association. Adeline has been raising awareness and advocating for the Made in Africa evaluation, an initiative promoting evaluation practice rooted in African contexts and priorities, as well as the South-South Cooperation and Evaluation, an initiative of 5 regional evaluation associations from the Global South. So without further ado, Adeline, we turn to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm going to look at the evidence-based policymaking implications for SDG 16 targets. And my presentation is based on the experiences that I've had in the different countries that I've worked, but mostly I'm presenting at a broader sort of view. So as we all know that during the past 2 decades, there has been increase in the production of evaluative evidence coming from policies, programs, projects. However, there has been limited use of this evaluative evidence to inform policymaking processes in all sectors, but particularly in the peace building arena. The assumption, which I believe is true, is that with better evidence, policymakers are better able to come up with better policies and contribute to peace, justice, and inclusive societies. So in addition, there has been concerns with regards to the type of evidence that is generated and its limitations in terms of contextual and cultural issues that are relevant to the affected populations, as well as the evidence users. I think we all know that using evidence contributes to improving the policy making process and the policy outcomes as well. There's, however, limited use of evidence, as I said, by policymakers. The policy making process is influenced by various environments and especially politics, and we cannot run away from that. And as was mentioned, SDG 16 is promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. So it places a great focus on the state, on power, on politics, and the rule of law. So SDG 16 is one of the most sensitive goals to track and report on, specifically in non-democratic countries. And I want to add that there's this stereotype that when anybody talks about non-democratic countries, we are automatically talking about the global south. And this is not correct. There are non-democratic societies in the global north. So we need to get rid of that stereotype as well. So the politics emphasized in the use of evidence needs to be further unpacked, coupled with the sensitivity of the SDG 16 itself. It becomes complicated and not so easy to advocate for use of evidence as in other SDGs, given the politics of evidence in this sector. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that we need to recognize the sensitivity of SDG 16. So SDG 16 is elusive to measure due to its sensitivity to evaluate and to report on. So most governments are not willing to report negative data about themselves, especially violation of human rights, for example. This could result in selective reporting or hiding information. In the end, the very use of evidence is curtailed at the evidence production level. How could a more conducive environment for producing and using evidence be created to ensure that SDG 16 targets are met? Well, I'm glad you asked. There's need for decentralizing evidence production, and which I know some countries are already doing, and for identification of unique and innovative ways to produce and use evidence that are specific to the context. For example, within the African context, evidence-based policymaking should reflect the context and lived realities within the specific community, country, or continent. In my case, I'm talking about the African context, as well as the policy environment. It is important to ensure that the context of the policymaking arena is appropriate to the culture and the values, thereby contributing to uptake of evidence. And I really want to emphasize the need for co-design of evidence and co-creation with the people that are affected, and that is using local knowledge and experiences. And this contributes to more evidence creation and uptake. The evidence could start off being used at local levels until it is taken up at subnational and national levels. So the role of civil society and non-state actors is very important in the production of evidence. And we should also be encouraged to ensure there is accountability and a neutral voice outside governments. This type of decentralizing the production of and use of evidence would definitely help. So in addition to understanding the politics of evidence, it is important to explore more the contextual issues that influence the use of evaluative evidence in policymaking, especially for sensitive SDGs such as SDG 16. Specifically, the influence of culture and values in the uptake and use of evidence. It is important to embrace the different interpretation of terms because sometimes one term can mean one thing to another group, while another term means differently. And also perceptions of peace, justice, and accountability is perceived by the different cultures and communities that we are operating in. So then the need to embrace local knowledge cannot be overemphasized. The use of evidence and good information to influence policy change and action is not being given enough emphasis, I would say, and the seriousness it deserves. It is important for us to increase pressure for policymakers, and it's not just at national level, but also at subnational levels as well, to use a rational approach to policymaking and minimize the impact of ideology and emotions in the policymaking process. And I believe if we do this, we will be able to contribute towards meeting the SDG 16 target. Some questions that could be explored as we discuss more around this issue is, what contextual factors influence the use of evaluative evidence in policymaking processes in the peace building sector that you are operating in? You know, being very specific to where you're operating in. What role has politics played in the use of evidence in different settings, specifically for SDG 16, wherever you're operating from? How could community engagement and co-creation in the production of evidence be more developed to influence the use of evidence for SDG 16? I believe we'll be able to deliberate more as we go along this discussion. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adeline. I really appreciate your presentation and the sticky issues of the politics of evidence and how can we, what can we do to make evidence not only useful but used? So what contextual factors, et cetera. So thank you for raising that. We will, if anyone wants to be putting any notes of questions in the chat, we will be coming to questions at the end of all the presentations. But over time, you can make notes of any questions and we'll kind of review the chat as we get into the discussion at the end of the session. For now, having thanked Adeline for opening us up with that presentation, I want to turn to Dr. Tammy Smith, who currently serves as a senior advisor for the UN Peacebuilding Fund at the United Nations. She has previously worked in several other roles in the UN system. She's worked within UNICEF. She received her PhD in sociology from Columbia University and has experience in field work in the international development sector, as well as within academia. Prior to joining the UN, Tammy worked at SUNY Stony Brook as an assistant professor of sociology while researching conflict and post-conflict settings. So thank you so much, Dr. Tammy Smith. Appreciate you joining us and bringing your perspectives and some insights from the UN Peacebuilding Fund. How can we engage evidence-based practices? Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. We're really happy to join. And I see a couple of my colleagues also on the line. So when we open up to questions and answers, if I've missed anything, please, I'm asking them to fill in. So I think, I mean, following Adeline was really, I think, tremendously helpful, because at the Peacebuilding Fund, we are really situated right in the middle of exactly those sensitivities that she so eloquently highlighted around how to try to generate evidence on what are at heart some pretty sensitive political matters. So let me just, that's sort of the overarching framework, and I just wanted to highlight some sort of 3 key initiatives that we are sort of rolling out at the moment. So nothing that we can sort of point to right now, but they are processes in place. And so also it's helpful to share this kind of information with a wider audience and hear about others' experiences so we can also learn from them. And so I just wanted to, again, like these sort of 3 key initiatives around how we are trying to generate evidence for us, for the conflict affected communities that we serve, for our donors, and for other partners, and more generally within sort of the knowledge base. And so I mean, at the sort of very cursory level, the 3 include initiatives around impact evaluation, around trying to generate common understanding around what strategic outcomes should be at the country level and how they relate to lower either project level or more local forms of change in peace building. And then finally, I'm going to touch upon some of these sort of very community-driven accountability mechanisms that also will be generating some data, hopefully in a way that is meaningful and useful, both for local communities as well as other kinds of decision makers. And again, sort of looping back around to Adeline's very salient points around that kind of sort of appreciating the knowledge and the importance of inclusion of different levels of evidence. So just to really just throw some things on the table so that we can discuss them a little bit later. On the impact evaluation side, this is something that is actually quite new for the PBF, in part because it's really expensive. And we're now sort of benefiting from support from the German Foreign Office because as many of our donors, Germany is very interested in trying to understand in part how their contribution to us is helping to generate some sort of effectiveness or change, a positive change at country level. And they want us to produce better evidence about that. But also a sort of concern for trying to fill in some of the gaps. And our starting point for this impact evaluation study was actually looking at an evidence gap map generated by the organization 3IE. And they sort of, if you take a look at this evidence gap map, the first thing that sort of jumps off the page at you is that it's much more gappy than evidence-y. And so the sort of space for filling in the evidence gap map was a pretty broad space. So we were looking both at what that evidence gap map was suggesting would be sort of helpful in terms of generating broader knowledge on what works and what doesn't work, and pair that up with very areas that we are very often called upon to fund as a kind of leap of faith. And so we were trying to sort of find that sort of sweet spot. And in the end, we are really, we honed in on questions around kind of local, sometimes more traditional mechanisms around conflict management, conflict resolution, and looking at the efficacy of those efforts or how they tie into other kinds of mediation or conflict management approaches. And then a sort of separate stream around land-based conflicts that I think will also be extremely interesting. And the case study areas will be Mali, Sudan, and Guatemala. And so I think that will be a sort of interesting multi-year effort to keep an eye on. We're hoping that it will generate some positive evidence about what works. But in any case, even the evidence around what doesn't work is still equally useful. And we understand also that to try to, so that'll help us sort of tease out some very specific research questions, right? So it's not looking like at an overall multidisciplinary project about what works or doesn't work. It's more sort of very, very specific to sort of actually broaden it out to try to see what our collective contribution to a given context has been. Now I'm sort of shifting to the sort of second point, which is that starting in 2021, we're guiding country-based teams through a process to articulate strategic outcomes that every project that we fund will need to sort of advance and connect to. And these strategic outcome frameworks will be in place for 5 years, which is a period of a country's eligibility to PBF. To get at these frameworks, we're supporting very participatory workshops to try to pull together a diverse set of stakeholders to actually think about, you know, if we're working in a certain area, what does that change look like 5 years from now? And how we start putting down some indicators and begin collecting data on those higher level changes so that we can actually see the contribution of unique or discrete efforts into those changes. And then, you know, once we have those frameworks, of course, it'll be important to start monitoring them, which is all about also generating data. And I want to say here, shifting into the third point, central to our strategic monitoring strategy will be collecting data at the really local level. And so we are really pleased to be engaged right now in an initiative to develop a community-based monitoring and evaluation mechanism, which will essentially be trying to partner with conflict-affected communities whom we serve, and really asking them whether what we're doing is making a positive difference about the things that they care about. For this initiative, we're grateful to have Dr. Landon Hancock, a professor from Kent State University in the US, who has joined our team while on sabbatical. And he'll be leading the development of guidance around this new CB-M&E approach, and we'll be rolling out a pilot to test this mechanism. And our hope is that as much as it'll be a way for us to gather data and monitor the relevance of effectiveness of what we support, it will also be really a critical accountability mechanism that can provide more agency to conflict-affected populations within the decision-making and policy-making settings or mechanisms that we already have in place, either within the UN at headquarters level or at country level within sort of these national, sort of typically capital-based joint steering committees of our work that up until now has had precious little engagement directly with local communities. And so we see this community-based monitoring and evaluation mechanism as being another sort of entry point to amplify the voices of local communities. I think also importantly, and sort of echoing what we just heard before, is that the indicators themselves need to come from the communities, right? They have to be meaningful, they have to sort of be owned, and they have to really express, I think, the lived experience, the goals, the hopes, and the opinions of the communities that we're serving. And so we'll be trying to partner with them to identify measures that actually speak to that reality. And I would ask maybe Landon, when we open this up, to sort of fill in anything I may be missing there. So I'll stop here just to note that we're also changing our approach to project level evaluations in these sort of longer term programmatic settings. But in the interest of time, I really just wanted to highlight these three key initiatives: the impact evaluations, these 5-year strategic frameworks, and this community-based monitoring and evaluation mechanism. And if anyone's interested to hear about the other changes, I'm happy to discuss in Q&A or bilaterally. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And did you want us to turn to Landon Hancock now for a moment on the collecting data at the local level?
I mean, if there's time now, if Landon has any like a sort of 2 cents to add.
Landon, as you wish, we can come to you when we turn to discussion for a minute or two. Yeah, we'll come to him then when we come to discussion. We put him on the spot there. So thank you so much, Dr. Tammy Smith. Really appreciate those kind of understanding the 3 clear directions that UN Peacebuilding Fund is taking now with building the evidence base, filling in the very gappy evidence gap map. So that's very helpful. So with that, I noticed that we've got a few comments going on in the chat, and at least one question posed already. So please do feel free to use the chat to make note of your questions. And then when we get to the discussion time, we'll work through questions that have been posed there. Let's try to use the chat for the questions and substantive comments to make it not get too long with things less relevant to the session. So thank you so much, Dr. Tammy Smith. We now turn to Dr. Yekaterina Romanova. Kate Romanova is an alumna of the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, and really great to have you come back and join us. Kate is a senior social development specialist at the World Bank. She's speaking in her personal capacity today, but I really am happy for her to be here as our alum and bringing her insights from lots of various experience. She received her PhD here at the Carter School for when it was for conflict analysis and resolution. Now we're the Cutter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason. And her dissertation research focused on the challenges of identity formation in the context of immigration trends in modern Russia. Her regional focus is in the Russian Commonwealth, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And Yekaterina is interested in issues of global migration, identity politics, nationalist violence, and gender. So speaking again today in her personal capacity, so her views should not be attributed to the World Bank, but we're very interested to hear your views on evidence-based approaches for SDG 16. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Susan. It's so nice to be back in the Carter School community. As Susan mentioned, I'm a graduate. Back then it was, I started at ICAR and then graduated from SCAR, and now I'm happy to join the Carter School community again. I am a senior social development specialist at the World Bank, working on environmental and social risk management and environmental and social risk compliance. Again, I'm representing, I will be sharing my views, and I do not represent the position of the World Bank. In the last almost 10 years, I've been working on social risk management across the globe. I started in Central Asia and worked across Africa, and now I work in East Asia and Pacific region. And through my work, I've become convinced that a lot of, and my work requires a lot of groundwork, direct engagement with communities, and in a wide range of development projects. And through my work, I have become a strong believer that through bottom-up approach, one can facilitate sustainable development, encourage transparency, community engagement, and hopefully through this engagement, build capacity and institutions from bottom up. And the two previous speakers emphasized the importance of the community engagement and this bottom-up approach. So in the environmental and social stresses affect the most vulnerable across the world, and global warming associated consequences disproportionately affect the poor. So ultimately, it is the communities that are left to deal with the direct impacts and challenging and adapting to the new environment. In the span of the last 20, 30 years, there has been an increased recognition that forecasting, accounting for and mitigating environmental and increasingly more social risk in developmental work result in greater and more sustainable outcomes. And increasingly international organizations, multilateral organizations have over time started introducing environmental safeguards, principles, safeguards, standards. The vocabulary, the terminology may vary from one organization to another, but the principles, the core principles remain very similar. And if the initial idea was do no harm in those developmental projects, over time this approach evolved into strengthening, improving, facilitating, boosting sustainability. And using the World Bank as an example, the World Bank has introduced environmental and social framework across its projects, and that environmental and social framework was introduced in 2018 and includes 10 environmental and social standards. They put and those standards range from an umbrella environmental social assessment to more specific standards dealing with labor issues, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, land acquisition, cultural heritage, and engaging with stakeholders at different stages of project preparation and implementation. And this framework offers a much broader and expanded mechanism for social risk management. Previously, social risk was often limited to understanding of impacts on land acquisition, physical and economic resettlement, impact on livelihood and indigenous peoples. And increasingly, that understanding expanded into a wide range of issues that go beyond land livelihood. So in this new approach, early planning, not post factum add-on evaluation and assessment of risks or something that happened and there is a desire to address what happened, but rather the early planning is the key for mitigating those risks and also ensuring long-term sustainability and outcomes of development project. Early engagement in the community can inform the design, make it culturally and community sensitive, and that social knowledge that the previous speakers talk about becomes integrated in the design, and this is a key for local buy-in and long-term success of the project. Once the project implementation ends, it's important that the community continues reaping benefits of that project. As I mentioned, that early engagement boosts buy-in of the community, acceptance of projects. It's something that's not imposed from above by financiers or government, but it's integrating what is communities require, what they prioritize, what they need. And it's important that it is important to the people and their opinions matter in the project planning and implementation. So that early engagement with stakeholders at the local level, regional, sub-regional, and national helps build a wider support, mitigate the risks that can range from lack of buy-in and not supporting the project post-completion, reputational risks, so all, and can result in broad protests and really anti protests. Even those projects that can involve initial real or perceived sacrifice, whether it's a physical or economic resettlement, relocation, for example, of markets, or physical resettlement of people, construction of new facilities, rehabilitation of the roads, those perceived sacrifices, they can be viewed as a necessary something that needs to be done for the success, for the long-term benefit of the community. Looking at labor risks and often change the perception of what is appropriate, what is acceptable, whether child labor or forced labor, where the sense of the community, where communities takes on and carries that accountability for harm on their young, also people with special needs, and looking at those labor risks is important for different types of labor force, whether it's a community labor or contracted labor that can also produce unintended consequences and harms for the community. Working with individuals on land acquisition and resettlement, ensuring that gender aspects, for example, are considered and paid attention in compensation payments, for example, that both spouses, women are accounted and receive those compensations, that they understand what the entitlements are and what their desires are for resettlement and reconstruction, rebuilding of their community. Additionally, engaging communities and especially working with indigenous peoples goes beyond just the broad community support, requiring greater engagement and where the community feels that they're responsible for the outcomes of the project. They become active participant of the process and not something that happens to them where the communities are recipients of the project rather than active participants. And that active participation is key and often comes with awareness of that environmental and social risks are real for the community, and they are accountable and responsible for mitigating and ensuring the success of the projects. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions as we get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I really appreciate that perspective and your emphasis of the early planning, early engagement, local engagement, gender issues considered, and the community becoming active participants as opposed to something done to them. So thank you for bringing us that. And I see more questions and some answers already are being posed in the chat. And people can continue to post questions there. We'll come to those at the end of the presentations. We'll now turn to Yahuska Barrios, who is Head of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning, MEL, at Conciliation Resources. Yahuska Barrios joined Conciliation Resources in 2019 as head of the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning unit. She manages the design and strategy of Conciliation Resources systems, skills, and approach to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Before joining Conciliation Resources, Barrios managed the monitoring, evaluation, and learning strategy and systems for global disability programs in Southeast Asia, East Africa, and Latin America. She's worked as a consultant to the United Nations and NGOs working on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, governance, climate change adaptation programs. She's also worked for a UK-based international development organization in Nicaragua, leading their water, sanitation, and climate change adaptation work. She holds a master's in science from University College London in globalization and Latin American development, and she's also an international tax lawyer. So with that introduction, we turn to Yahuska Barrios. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It was my plan to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Perfectly fine, perfect. All right, thank you so much for that introduction. As Susan was saying, I am head of monitoring, evaluation, and learning for Conciliation Resources. Conciliation Resources have been working in mediation, support, dialogue, engaging with armed groups, dealing with the past, inclusion, and climate change and environmental peace building for over 25 years, and we work in over 8 different contexts. As many organizations that work in peace building and that work in diverse places, such as we do, we all often find the same issues when trying to use data to kind of inform our programs and our policy. One of the issues is finding out how to best capture evidence of the work that we do, considering that most traditional monitoring evaluation systems are often quite linear and they don't really capture the complexity of the kind of conflicts in which we are working, which are constantly changing and therefore are quite difficult to measure or to to develop set indicators for them. And another of the issues often is the difficulty of acting fast enough to use the evidence that we are gathering to adapt our programs fast enough so that we can use that information and that data to improve those programs as we go. And finally, how do we engage with the evidence so that it improves our practice in an efficient way that we can also contribute to to policy making and to policy messages? So in the need to try to find all of this, Conciliation Resources started using an outcome harvesting, which is a monitoring and evaluation methodology that has been used outside of the peace building work, but it is specifically useful for peace building because it captures the complexity of the work that we do. So our plan was identifying what would be the best way for an organization like us and to provide example for other organizations that find the same challenges that we do, and how to develop learning processes and practices that allow us to use the evidence-informed programming and planning and use that evidence to promote adaptation and experimentation. So I'll be talking a little bit about what is outcome harvesting and why it's different than many other monitoring evaluation practices or approaches. Outcome harvesting is a methodology that does not measure progress towards predetermined indicators. So the reason why we try not to set these predetermined indicators, as I was mentioning before, is because our conflicts in which we work and the context in which we work are constantly changing. That doesn't mean that we don't have theories of change and that we don't have a plan on what we're trying to do, but it just means that we're more flexible in terms of like what that change would look like in reality. Outcome harvesting then rather collects evidence of what has changed and then works backwards to determine whether and how an intervention contributed to these changes. So why did we use outcome harvesting from all the myriad of many monitoring and evaluation methodologies that are in the world? First of all, because it's holistic, it brings more space and freedom to identify unintended results. So we found in our evidence that most of the results that we analyzed, or the most valuable of our outcomes, were actually things that we couldn't identify at the beginning of the project, or that we couldn't have envisioned that they were going to happen. Because outcome harvesting measures changes that are observable, so these are changes in behavior, it employs various methods and levels of analysis and corroboration to see if that change in behavior actually happened. It is different than other methodologies that, for example, measure changes in attitudes, which are even less tangible and more difficult to measure. Outcome harvesting is more accessible, so it uses a logical and accessible approach that makes it easy to engage informants. Because when we are on the ground, we simply ask what has changed as a result of this project. Why is that change significant, and how did we contribute to that change? But we also recognize that there are several actors acting in all the different interventions that we work, and therefore we also ask who else contributed to those changes. So then we can learn from all the other contributors as well, and we can create partnerships, and we can work together with other organizations working on the ground or with policymakers to enhance the work that we do. Outcome harvesting is also practical, as it employs various means to collect data. It is, as you probably know, very difficult to travel and to access some of the places, in conflicts where we work. So data collection has always been an issue. And keeping people safe is our priority, and making sure that we're not putting people at danger by collecting data. So outcome harvesting allows us to do this remotely if necessary. During this year, we have been doing outcome harvesting, and we've collected over 248 outcomes without having to travel to any of the conflicts in which we work. And finally, outcome harvesting is participatory and reflective. So we bring people, critical friends, people with knowledge, either from the program that is implementing that particular intervention, or from different programs that people that may have knowledge in similar conflicts, or people that may have thematic knowledge, or that are experts in gender and inclusion, or that are experts in monitoring and evaluation, to bring reflection on the outcomes that have been found, and to assess and challenge the assumptions made in the theory of change. And most importantly, to analyze what is the evidence telling us about what works and what doesn't, and how can we use that to improve our programming practices. So the way in which we've incorporated this cycle into the organization is by, first of all, making sure that we have a theory of change at the beginning of each one of our interventions. Design the harvest on the melt plan, collect data, which is done using diverse data collection methods, formulate outcomes on a day-to-day basis. So every day, every outcome that we observe is input into a digital platform. And then we offer a first tier of analysis, which is done by the MEL team. And they MEL team review the quality of the data and provides feedback to the program team, whether if the outcome is strong enough, whether if the outcome has enough rigor, whether if the outcome is something that it's an evidence that is worthwhile using. Outcomes are then modified if need to, reject or approve. And then we have a second tier of analysis. The second tier of analysis is done in a workshop where we invite people from different expertise, from around the organization to an 8 hours analysis workshop in which we analyzed all of the outcomes that have been collected over the year, and we assessed them against the theory of change. In this workshop, we also see and analyze the outcomes from a gender and inclusion perspective, which is very important. And we do that by inviting specialists in gender and inclusion. If the program continues in implementation, so the analysis of this and the evidence that is provided in this space is used on how to improve the program. If needed, we can modify the theory of change. If this happens towards the end of the project, then we add a third level of analysis, which is done by an external evaluator who substantiate the outcomes by talking to third parties that are not necessarily involved in the program implementation, but that are knowledgeable in the conflict, who can say if the outcomes that we have collected and analyzed are true or not, and what is the evidence telling us about the conflict and theory of change within the conflict analysis. All right, so what have we learned? So we've learned that doing this process, we put our evidence at the center of our strategic planning processes, really allows us to act based on our evidence. We learned that it is value for money because we're bringing expertise from around the organization, expertise that in different thematic areas, and we make our analysis richer. We've learned that it's in terms of human resources and optimization, as we are measuring what matters most rather than just collecting data for the sake of that. We improved our internal learning and foster adaptive management. But most importantly, we realized by doing this process, we're addressing two major areas of difficulties in MEL and peace building, which is rigor and evidence of what works. By doing this process, every outcome tells us what worked to achieve that outcome, particularly what worked well and what didn't work. So then we can present evidence of that to our donors, but most importantly, use it for learning. So we have challenges and limitations, obviously. So some of the challenges is that at the beginning, it feels as an increasing workload for our programming teams. However, once they have been trained and once they get used to uploading outcomes every time that they see it, it becomes a second nature to them. And actually it's something that they do in 15 minutes. Training is required, and this requires quite a lot of time, especially from the MEL team. Donor buy-in is required because this is a process that is not based on, it doesn't put accountability first, it puts learning first. It doesn't mean that it's not useful for accountability, it is. However, our main priority is to use the information to learn and how to do things better and to be able to demonstrate what works and what doesn't. It requires trust and openness. So we can only do this if we have built that culture within an organization. So it is a little bit more challenging when you are working with other organizations and consortia working. And finally, that there's a dearth of evaluators with experience in peace building and in outcome harvesting. And with this, we encourage more many professionals to know more about outcome harvesting and about peace building and to match these two areas, as we found them quite useful. So some of the key learnings that, or the key pieces of evidence that we found this year, I just brought one example of it, is in relation to evidence-based practice to improve horizontal relations between local peace building actors and local governments. So we found that in using outcome harvesting in the Philippines, Northeast Nigeria, and Bougainville, we found 5 areas that worked very well to achieve most of our outcomes there in relation to horizontal relationships. One was improving peace building and dialogue education, especially about gender-sensitive conflict analysis, increasing engagement of traditional community leaders in economic and political decision-making spaces. The third one was that worked very well was working with existing community leaders and supporting local agency rather than parachuting external people. Adapting our dialogue styles from an inquiry-led, using an inquiry-led rather than a solution focus, meaning that we're trying to find information and leading community leaders to identify what needs to happen in their communities rather than trying to find solutions and bring solutions into the places where we work. And 5, the mental and psychosocial support needs to be available along the entire process. I think I'm going to stop here, but leave some space for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joska. Very useful to see really specific outcome harvesting example and how you've used it throughout conciliation resources and with what effect that's had in terms of the learning emphasis for conciliation resources. So thank you very much. Appreciate that contribution to our conversation about evidence-based approaches. We need to be able to generate the evidence, and you've given us specific examples of ways you're doing that. We will now turn to our final presentation. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Margarita Tadevosian. She is currently serving as Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project, and she will be moving soon to Research Assistant Professor at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, where she'll have more focus on her own research. But she is also currently teaching in conflict resolution program here at the Carter School, teaching evaluation, very relevant to the evidence-based creation here. She has her PhD from the Carter School in conflict analysis and resolution. She also has a master's in public policy from George Mason and a master's from Yerevan State University. Her expertise as a scholar practitioner is focused on local peacemakers, interactions with international peacemakers. She has experience as both a local peacemaker from being in Armenia and engaging in the peacemaking work there, and an international peacemaker working from outside the region in more broadly in the South Caucasus and beyond. She has expertise in dialogue processes and is engaging with U.S. Institute of Peace now in a project looking at the evidence base about what works in dialogue. So without further ado, turn it over to our final presenter for the day, Dr. Margarita Tadevosian. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really pleased to be part of this panel as we talk about how we can improve peace building, peacemaking goal as part of the SDG 16, and how we can use evidence to support these processes. My presentation will largely focus on my recent research or an ongoing research that focuses on understanding of and conceptualization of peace peace and evidence that relates to peacemaking and peace building from the local perspectives. I have conducted extensive interviews with over 50 local peace builders and peace practitioners from what we usually call Global South, representing different geographic contexts from Southeast Asia to Africa, Latin America, former Soviet Union, Balkans, Caucasus, and Mexico, and other locations where the research tries to understand what peace means in the local context, how evidence about that peace is gathered, and what it means to local practitioners and local populations, and with a specific emphasis how that evidence is being communicated to also from local level to international partners, and how it feeds into policies that Adeline was mentioning of developing better policies for peacemaking and peace building. I will start by saying that on the local level, peace, even though there are countries that are often ravaged by violent conflict and have seen years of devastation and war happening, peace is often being defined more than absence of violence. So there is a very kind of inclusive and sophisticated concept looking at the peace that includes social justice systems, that includes human rights. As Tammy has mentioned, there is a lot of, especially in Africa, in Uganda, that I've seen that there is a lot of emphasis on property rights and human rights and land rights, civic participation. For example, in Mexico, there is a big issue in terms of civic participation. and access to different governance systems. So with this kind of diverse perception of peace, it is important also to understand and to for policymakers, for donors, and us practitioners working from the outside, how this diverse perception of peace can be supported through evidence and what evidence means in each of this context. It is not it's not a kind of secret that most of the times peace building and peacemaking work are supported, are presented or take a form of programmatic action that are supported by various donor organizations, both like regionally but also internationally. So how the kind of funding and how programmatic approaches are being made available to this local actors also defines the way that the evidence is being generated. Unfortunately, what I kind of came across in my conversations with a lot of the peace practitioners locally is that the current monitoring and evaluation matrices that are usually not in every case, but what are usually presented or are in use for this type of work do not really allow to capture the core of the work that is being done on the local level, but and also does not allow to capture the uniqueness and culturally appropriate way of presenting the evidence. As Jauska has mentioned in her presentation, like a lot of like gender sensitivity and making having a conflict analysis that is sensitive on different aspects that are related to a particular context is an important factor. However, a lot of times local practitioners feel that they're struggling to put everything that they are experiencing within their communities into this kind of frameworks that are being currently used and dominated to in this kind of international peace building, peacemaking system. One kind of major flaw of this, as also Adeline mentioned, is they don't encourage learning in a way that captures both the positive and the negative of the things that are happening on the ground. Like the same way that national governments are under-reporting or tend not to report the bad outcomes and negative data on human rights abuses, the same way local practitioners feel that there is no there is no constructive way or positive way of including some of the failures and things that didn't work in their particular context to the donors and making it part of the evidence-based being afraid that that will kind of affect the way that their funding, it will affect their future funding. So again, like there is a big disconnect between monitoring and evaluation that is happening on a programmatic level and the learning that is transferred to like higher level and becomes general learning for not only those practitioners on the ground, because they still learn from their experiences and they kind of understand what works, what doesn't work. However, their learning is not transferred into more global learning for other practitioners, even within their own kind of communities and the similar kind of geographic space that they're working. So with that, I want to say that while this is a very complex and complicated situation that will not be resolved immediately and have like an immediate kind of answer how we go about it, several things that I have noticed that I would suggest as kind of going forward in terms of strengthening the evidence-based practices would be generation of organic generation of evidence that reflects the time-specific and context-specific bound realities on the ground. Some things that didn't work, again, in a particular context, in a particular time, might be relevant and acceptable at a different time. Also, looking at non-quantifiable evidence, things that are happening, and I think a lot of like kind of outcome tracing outcome harvesting, as Yaoska mentioned, kind of will help to capture some of this on the ground, but like non-quantifiable evidence of what is being traced within a change in the social system or change within the community that can kind of in a long term be attributed or at least kind of credited to certain activities being conducted. And also another thing that a lot of peace practitioners mention, they're struggling with a way of capturing or presenting non-direct evidence of the work that they have been that they have been doing. For example, when I was speaking to one practitioner from India who was working mostly with like dealing with Christian Muslim divide in his own communities, he said that after many years of the workshops that they have been doing, what they see now is more involvement or like more girls being enrolled in schools. While they cannot directly, that's not a direct evidence of the work that they do, but some of the work that they have done they feel has contributed to this, and they feel that they have no way of capturing that evidence in a way that would represent the work that they do, but also become kind of part of like this larger set of evidence. So with that being said, I think like for me the key word is kind of the organic creation of evidence and the synergy between local and global, and in this case elevating local to become sort of global. I think right now the way it works, the vector of influence comes from global north to global south, and there is this kind of disconnect and kind of well, for lack of a better word, kind of patronizing approach that is kind of trickles down to the global south. So I think making and elevating the local knowledge to become part of global, and also using local practitioners as experts, field experts in other global contexts will help to increase their capacity and also make them more comfortable talking about how they view the evidence, and also present the ways that they view the evidence. So centering the evidence that targets also the latent and or undercover or underrepresented issues that are we see or we don't see from the ground but are more visible to the local practitioners. That's another way that we can strengthen the evidence support and evidence base, and also highlighting the learning as a peace building structure rather than that makes it sustainable in terms of peace building practices would be a kind of a way to go. One complaint that I've heard over and over again is that a lot of times caught into programmatic work, local organizations feel that they don't have time to do longitudinal monitoring and evaluation of their activities to kind of see from the beginning till the end what type of work they're doing, and kind of generate evidence based on not a specific program that they have implemented, but the years of experience that they're bringing from the field. So I think this kind of were the kind of key highlights of the current ongoing research, and I'm still in the process of looking at the data. It's not a complete kind of, this is a kind of preliminary insights from all the interviews that I have conducted. But I think there is one thing that struck with me, one kind of quote or thing that one of my Bosnian interlocutors told me, and it kind of captures how how we are still in disconnect in a way that the evidence that are being presented or like results that are being presented to the international community versus what is actually happening on the ground. So one of my respondents in Bosnia said that despite what internationals think about Bosnia, the war is not over. The conflict is very much alive. Even though there is kind of, I don't want to say the world has forgotten Bosnia, but it is not one of those kind of hot topics that are that is on everybody's mind, and we have other things to currently worry about with different crises emerging. However, this kind of captures how local peace builders feel that they need to frame certain things in a certain way to continue to stay relevant, and that kind of skews the way the evidence is presented. And I think there is this need of changing the dynamics and making generation of evidence in context time specific, with an emphasis of understanding how it reflect the local local concerns and local perceptions. So I will stop there, and I will happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Margarita. And that's really sobering to hear your kind of comment near the end there about the war is not over in Bosnia, and that being a local perspective, which is not what we see from afar in the international community. So really sobering to think about how to understand local perspectives and their evidence of what's working for peace and preventing war in their own communities. So thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is, as we move into the discussion session, I'd like to first I'll turn to Dr. Landon Hancock, who was mentioned as speaking a bit on the community level data at the Peace Building Fund. And then I'd like to turn to each of our presenters to take just a couple minutes and reflect on any of the questions that were in the chat that you'd like to speak to. And so after Landon, I'm going to see Adeline sent me a note that the internet was unstable there given a storm. So if your internet's working, Adeline, we'll turn to you as the first presenter, and kind of go back through that order of presenters just to let you engage with some of the chat messages. And then we'll start with our first chat message, a question on how can practitioners be persuaded to base their activity on evidence and to have the evidence-based guide practitioner activity. So that will be our first discussion question once we go to Landon and then the speakers, and then we'll engage that question. So Landon, if you're ready to speak a bit, we'll turn to you on the community level data that the Peace Building Fund is gathering.
Well, we're developing some plans at this point, so I'm happy to speak a little bit about that. We're in the process of developing some concepts and some guidance around a project, and I want to thank Tammy and her colleagues at UNPBF for welcoming me there, and thank you for setting up this roundtable. I think some of the things people have been talking about are very much in alignment with some of the things that we're thinking about, and some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of local peace building for a long time. It occurs to me that this idea of evidence from the local needs to get away from evidence being defined largely or totally by the global north, by the funders and the donors, because that leaves out the possibility of different kinds of benefits from peace building that we wouldn't normally think about. So when we think about the idea of looking at evidence drawn from the local indicators, as Roger McGinty and Pamina Furchow have done with their EPI project, Everyday Peace Indicators project, we're thinking about piggybacking onto that to find out what local people think is happening, right? So it's very similar to what some of the other presenters have been talking about. And to think about using processes that involve stakeholders at all levels of the peace building process, from the local beneficiary community all the way up to the UNPBF headquarters, to work in a more collaborative fashion, to have sort of a continuous monitoring and evaluation, starting with those at the beneficiary level, so that they can hold the peace building delivery people as well as others accountable for some of the changes that are going on. And if you think about the kinds of processes that need to take place with that, the organizing, the commitment, the meetings, the discussion, the investigation, all of that produces not only local agency as opposed to just local ownership or local participation, but it can also produce a kind of social cohesion, social capital, if you will, that can contribute to what you might think about as small d democratic institution building, to help build those communities, build the civil society. And these kinds of outcomes can also be defined as outcomes of peace building. Maybe not on the project themselves, but there are positive outcomes that can contribute to the kind of sustainable peace that we all say we want to have when we engage in peace building. And so that's some of the things we're beginning to think about with this and trying to grapple with how to facilitate that, how to engender that, how to come and work with partners at all levels to try and create more of a sustainable peace in the end. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Landon. So now I do see that it looks like Adeline has had to drop off because the internet was unstable there. So if we could turn to Tammy, if you have any comments based on things that were placed in the chat. Some of them I see you've already addressed, but anyone you wanted to talk through?
Yeah, maybe just the recurring comments around the PBF and funding local, very, very local organizations. And I mean, admittedly, we have some very serious challenges to funding extremely local. Just the nature of the way that we are set up as a fund. And I think as much as we do try to extend as far as we can, I think we have also a healthy appreciation that not every fund is appropriate for everybody. So I think, you know, since we don't have offices in the specific countries, so we are only a headquarters-based fund that funds out. And so to do that kind of really sort of sensitive work around, especially sort of vetting, but also the outreach, like to really know who your partners are at local level, it really requires a different kind of presence in the country to be able to help support that and manage that we just simply don't have. We are testing right now in the next year a sort of managing agent facility for the Sahel, where we will be working with, I believe it's Peace Direct, I think, although I think that's a process in play right now. I don't think it's been finalized. But to set up a sort of small fund for work in the Sahel, I think it's mostly around the sort of cross-border issues, that actually is designed to try to go under our $300,000 minimum threshold for direct funding to CSOs and actually reach smaller grassroots organizations. So that will be, I think, a test for us to see how that goes. To be honest, we're already getting pushback from many of our donors because these managing agent agreements are quite expensive, like the administrative costs of doing that. So it's our only way around trying to offset the other kinds of risks that would come and which we are not in a position to take on for doing that ourselves. So it's, yeah, we are sort of doing the best that we can within the limits of the kind of fund that we are. And I guess the main thing, for people who are encouraging of us to try to fund much smaller CSOs or grassroots organizations, is to keep watching the space of this pilot initiative for the Sahel to see how that goes.
Thank you. And Tammy, I appreciate kind of the sense that, you know, not one agency can do it all. You know, we each have our own different sorts of mechanisms and platforms and ways that we're allowed to work by our, you know, mandates and so forth. So yeah, working within the constraints that each of us face at our various institutions towards the peace work. Thank you. If we can turn to Kate, any comments on any of the issues raised in the chat?
I don't see any questions that I can answer right now, but I'm happy to take any questions as they come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yahuska, any of those you want to address? I see you've been active in the chat with already some responses, but any you want to speak to?
Yeah, just maybe one. There's a question about if we've received any feedback from the donors, or what kind of feedback we've received in relation to our evaluations using outcome harvesting. And yeah, just to say that so far our experience has been that the feedback has been widely positive. The reason for this is that we consider that by using outcome harvesting, we provide a little bit more of information about why are outcomes important. And this is something that we often assume from the peace building organizations. We assume that our donors have the same level of engagement, and that they would understand when we're saying that this amount of people created this change, or that this person said this differently. And we assume their knowledge in terms of that they would know why is that important, or what does that mean for our conflict analysis. So that is why the outcome harvesting evaluation reports are actually quite different than the normal evaluation reports. They really kind of put the conflict analysis at the center of our results. So that is one part of it. The other part, and I also touching on one of the other questions, was about contribution by other organizations. So the fact that we're not claiming or attributing all of the changes to us, but that we're saying, we are, these are the changes in which we are at a level of influence only, or these are the changes in which we are at the level of control. And this is what it means for our program in the long term as well. It means that you can engage the donor in a more equal conversation, where they can also say, well, this is what we want to see in the future. So that has made it quite a positive engagement so far. But if you want to know more, please let me know, contact, we can share our contacts, and I'll be more than happy to talk more about our experience.
Thank you. Thank you. And now if we can turn to Margarita, any of the issues from the chat that you'd like to speak to?
Yes, I would like to try and kind of get some answer, not even an answer, but a comment to the question about how can individuals in conflict zones use social media to provide clear evidence, evidence-based information to policymakers. I think social media, I mean, we all recognize the power of social media and how it can be used both in positive and negative form. I do see a value of kind of looking at social media, Facebook, Twitter, and other things to understand, and to capture some type of evidence. I think it mostly goes to what has been mentioned as indirect or non-direct evidence, in the sense that it will show the discussions, comment that are happening on social media can support and show and highlight some or give an insight to moods that kind of dominate a certain geography or a certain community at a given time, and they can speak to one approach, supporting one type of intervention approach versus other, or highlight some of the key issues that communities are experiencing at the moment. So again, I don't know how, I don't have a clear answer how to provide those that information directly to policymakers, but I believe that monitoring social media posts by peace practitioners can provide very good insight to indirect or non-direct evidence of certain conflict dynamics. And the other thing, I'm just going to put back my head, my BEP executive director head, and say that address kind of the second question: can peacekeepers be kept safe with the evidence-based practices? BEP is convening a working group on peacemakers and peace builder security, where a group of scholars and practitioners are looking at different aspects of security issues and threats that our peacemakers are experiencing in different contexts, and how to mitigate them, and to how collectively develop some evidence or what works or doesn't work. I will put Ziad on the spot, and because he is the lead for the group, and kind of ask him, maybe he has other insights. But if you are interested of becoming part of the working group that looks in particular at the how peacemakers security and safety, please email bep@gmu.edu, or Ziad can provide his email in the chat, so those who are interested can learn or join the work that the group is doing.
Thank you, Margarita. I had wanted to make a note of that, the question there on Peace Builder, Peacemakers, security, and highlight the working group that's happening now. And Ziad has put his email address as well as the BEP addresses in the chat for anyone who's interested in joining that. I also want to mention the working group that BEP is running now on case studies and ways of building our evidence base through case studies. If you're interested in that, please also email bep@gmu.edu, as we're happy to engage other scholar practitioners, policymakers, people interested in building our evidence base through case study work too. So now let's turn to one of the questions that was, I think, the first one posed in the chat was, how can practitioners be persuaded to base their activity on evidence? Who has ideas on that? Who can we turn to speak about how practitioners can be persuaded to base their activity on evidence?
If I may kind of take a first step and say that I think if we're talking about local practitioners, I do think that they do base their practices on the evidence that is available to them through their local practice. I think the question is how to create an equilibrium where the donor perception of evidence coincides, reflects, or aligns with the local perception of evidence. So, because a lot of times, again, how the proposals are being developed and how things are being conducted are very much based, as Lyndon also said, very much based at what Global North kind of dictates or puts into a framework. So I think the question is not how to encourage peace builders or practitioners to build their activities on the evidence, but how to build a synergy that we have similar understanding of what evidence is in a particular context. So that's my take on it.
Thank you. That really flips the question around from assuming there is lack of all evidence to questioning, well, what kinds of evidence are they basing their work on, and how can we learn from that and develop a synergy? Interesting. Tammy, your hand is raised.
It is. So yeah, I'll get distracted if I try to lower it right now, so I'll do that in a little bit. I mean, I think from a donor perspective, and as I just mentioned before, we're not the donor that's going to be funding directly, with a few exceptions. You know, the very, very grassroots organization that may actually have the sort of best connectivity with the kinds of local-based knowledge and evidence that Margarita was just talking about. And I mean, we are trying to get at that better at our country work through things like the community-based monitoring and evaluation initiative that Landon is working on. But as a donor, I mean, I think we also have a role to play in, and we try to really, I mean, I don't want to say encourage because it's stronger than that, but force is maybe too strong, to set a series of policies that require our fund users, so largely UN agencies, funds and programs, and the larger international NGOs, but also national NGOs, but the larger ones that can actually access our funds, to more meaningfully partner also with local communities, but also, and it's shocking to me how often we read project proposals that are not evidence-based, right? And I mean, we were hearing a lot throughout the whole conversation today about theories of change. I'm always shocked at how little evidence is sort of provided for the underlying assumptions of the theories of change. And how, so one way in which I think we also can do better is in demanding more from more evidence-based planning, decision-making, and then, you know, building that into our monitoring strategies to see whether those assumptions are actually holding. And by that way, try to also make the implementation. So Milt had also put in the chat a question around, you know, if evidence is actually showing that we got things wrong, are we willing to change? And the answer is yes. But again, like, we need to have our fund users actually having being open to hearing that, having access to that kind of information. And so, yeah, we're trying to set up systems that make that more doable. But it is not easy, and it is definitely a process of learning what works and what doesn't work. We've tried through some of our special calls for proposals, you know, requiring evidence of consultation with either local communities or with smaller grassroots organizations. And, you know, I'm sure that has in some ways helped a little bit, but it has not resolved the problem of like more directed, it's like contracting relationships rather than partnerships. So we know that that's not going to do it all. So again, like, it's just a process of learning and trying to constantly improve.
Thank you. Ziad, I saw your hand up. Did you want to go now? Or did you lower your hand on purpose?
No, I think I think this is a very important question. Hi everyone, my name is Ziad Ashkar. I work with BEP as one of the graduate assistants, PhD student at Carter School. I think it comes back to a question about direct funding. I know a lot of people that I've spoken to as part of my research, their biggest complaint always is, well, like Margarita said, the local communities, local practitioners, they are willing and they'll be persuaded by change because this is their lived realities. They know what needs to be done. The problem always comes back to donors don't want to fund them directly, or they don't fund them to a high percentage. You know, part of the work that I do is focused on humanitarian work, and it's, you know, I think 5% of funding goes directly to local communities, and the rest is funneled through different agencies and mechanisms. I think until we kind of flip the funding mechanism on their heads and empower local communities to make the decisions for themselves, give them more agency, and actually really see the power to local actors, that's going to be a problem. Donor agencies, NGOs, they also have to engage with the international politics of aid and donorships, and I think that's often not talked about enough. And so I think if we want to persuade practitioners to change their practices, we need to also persuade donors to change their funding mechanisms.
Thank you. So that would be a piece of the puzzle too. It's not just a question of what will persuade practitioners, but what will persuade donors to shift funding mechanisms. Thank you. Yaoska.
Yeah, just to support some of the things that my colleagues have already mentioned, and it is, I agree that local actors have the evidence. I agree that they actually use the evidence. I just often think that that evidence is not recorded in the way that donors would like to read it, or can engage with it, or can even receive it, or can be translated, even if we're talking about language. So often there's a lot of evidence, and when you are working with local actors, there is talk about this evidence and it's used frequently, but it is, how do we then invest in putting all of that in paper so it can reach the policymakers, so it can reach decision makers in terms of like donor related decision makers, so we can encourage change. I think that there could be more sources of funding specifically for this that accompany other programmatic interventions, and that focus mainly on like, how do we capture the data of the work that other people are doing. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a few minutes if there's any other comment that people want to make or question. I see Raju Bhatt, if you'd like to raise a question or comment.
Yes, thank you very much. Great presentation. I'm just wondering, how does this evidence-based approaches work with collecting geographic spatial analysis? I guess that's a new type of, or I don't know if it's new, but it's a type of science that's used for collecting data. And I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Thanks. Yeah, does anyone want to speak to using geoinformational systems or other geographic approaches that can be part of the evidence base and informing work?
I know who I can put on the spot for this.
Is Julie here?
Julie.
Julie Mendy, do you want to speak at all to that? Any overview? I know you could go on for a long time about it, but give us a quick summary. We may be putting her on the spot though. Okay, we'll come back to Julie if she can get to her unmuting and button. I see there's a comment there from Megan Greeley. Do you want to speak to that issue? To the issues you've been writing about?
Susan?
Hello.
Yeah, I can
Brandon,
try
hi.
and speak a little bit to that. I know that Pamina and Roger in South Africa used mobile phone networks to administer perception surveys. And so they used, geosynchronous information on that to locate where they were doing the interviews and some of the issues that were going on. And so I don't have a great deal of detail on that, but essentially part of that is going to require a certain level of technical know-how and a certain level of connection with, satellite services or Wi-Fi services that can be difficult to use in terms of, the cost as well as the infrastructure required. And that's maybe just one version of it. It's been some time, but I know Julie had a really nice chapter on this in an edited volume I did a few years ago, looking at GIS and its use. So it has been used. I don't have a lot of other detail on that, but essentially it can be used, I guess, in data collection or in data analysis.
Thank you. I see Tammy. You want to speak to that, Tammy?
Yeah, I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation, but just really briefly, we had just a handful of experiences with this, not as much as I think could be done, but one in particular that leaps to mind was an early, maybe like 2014, 2015 project in Sri Lanka that was trying to support female-headed household returning IDPs and refugees. And we were trying to look at the use of cell phone data, and in particular, the extent to which phones are used also for transferring money and tracking sustainable return by people's use of the phones in certain areas, and also other kinds of recordable, like sort of big data where you don't actually have to go and ask somebody, but that ties people to certain locations. So whether that's also sort of transactions at marketplaces and other things that may be a little bit more recordable, so that if we were seeing kind of like a dip after a certain, the initial move back and then a dip, then we kind of recognized that it wasn't all that sustainable, or people were sort of continuing to go between their places of displacement and places of return. So it was an interesting approach, but it's a sort of, it stands out in my mind because it's so rare.
Thank you. Thank you. So are there other issues on this evidence-based approaches, practices for addressing SDG 16? Then I may take a moment to ask you all to think about the Better Evidence Project. We're trying to really encourage evidence-based approaches that will prevent and end wars. And we see lots of challenges, some of which have been identified today. And one of the things we're going to be launching soon, and ask you all to please, sign up for our email list, bep@gmu.edu, because we'll be launching by the end of this year an online resource library where we want to make accessible some of the evidence that's can be placed in an online open access format for not only people at universities to be able to access, the scholarly work, but to translate insights from research to policymakers, practitioners, donors to help inform peacemaking work from the evidence base. So we are looking for people to be reviewers for the online resource library, looking for people who are advanced doctoral students or have significant research credentials to serve in that reviewer capacity. So you can reach us at bep@gmu.edu to be part of our peer reviewer pool. We're also looking for people to submit their evidence work, hoping to partner with many organizations who are producing their own reports, that we can provide links to those partner organization websites where we see quality work for the resource library. One of the things we've been doing is collecting ideas from practitioners, donors, policymakers about where they see gaps in the evidence base that they really would like our help with filling. And that's what I wanted to turn to now and ask you all, the people who have stayed on the call now, what evidence-based gaps do you see? And what evidence-based gaps would you like to see the Better Evidence Project contribute to filling, or partners that we can catalyze others working on? We can't do it all ourselves, but we hope to kind of create broadly throughout the field some efforts to collectively fill the gaps. So what are the evidence-based gaps that you personally, your organizations would want to see worked on? I see Raju, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just say briefly, I left a link there in the chat. I'm working with an organization that works with nonprofits, and they work with government organizations and schools, universities. They gather geospatial visualization technology and information. And so they're a great organization to partner with because they do work with universities. And they're actually assigning me two, three students who will be collecting data for Kashmir and India area for my project, which is a virtual reality platform for reconciliation and peace building. So they're actually providing the data that's going to be mapping, which I can't do, of course, and they have some amazing people there. So they're out of Indonesia, but I'm working with one of the persons who's out of Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Any other requests for filling of the evidence gap? Not that we can do it all, but we want to look for who can do what. We're getting more on the bringing the engineering perspectives and flying labs and so forth in the chat. Okay, well, I'm going to put our email address again, bep@gmu.edu, and invite you all to be in touch with your engagement. We're looking for partners to help shift the field towards more accessible evidence, more useful evidence that is actually used to strengthen our peacemaking work. With that, we will move to concluding and thank all of the presenters. Really appreciate you all responding to the request to join this panel. Appreciate all of our participants who've showed up and been so active in the discussion. Appreciate Margarita, your help with organizing the whole thing, getting everything set for the Zoom. Ziad, you've helped with keeping it going smoothly. Lots of behind the scenes work going on there. And the whole team at the Carter School, which has helped really put together the whole Peace Week. It's nice that we, as the Better Evidence Project, Center for Peacemaking Practice, can be part of the overall Carter School Peace Week series of events. Would like to refer you all to the rest of the Peace Week events. Ziad, if you're able to put the link to the Peace Week website in the chat, people can find other events going on this whole week at Peace Week at the Carter School. Tomorrow is the International Day of Peace. We'll be having the Carter Center's Chief Executive Officer join us for a conversation on International Day of Peace. That's the Carter Center in Atlanta, connecting with the Carter School at George Mason University. So thank you all for joining, and look forward to connecting in other events this week. Better Evidence Project is hosting another event on Friday evening, 6 p.m. You'll see that on the schedule of events. We'll be screening Soldiers Without Guns and having a conversation with the film director, William Watson, focused on Bougainville there. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Bye.